Back when I covered the first Tomba game, I expected to cover the follow-up at least within the same year. Though, a lot of my planning skills, or lack thereof, have kind of ended up revealing themselves making reviews, haven't they? It doesn't help that I have some faint memories of renting Tomba 2 as a kid and generally disliking it, sticking to the first game afterwards instead. Young me doesn't have the best track record with what I liked and disliked, but it still made me a bit wary of doing a review for Tomba 2, so I kept pushing it further and further back. I was looking for something short and different to cover between two dungeon crawler reviews, and I figured now might as well be the time. So here we are. Let's see how Tomba 2 holds up.
Hurry! Hurry! Ouch!
Tomba 2 follows Tomba and his new sidekick, Zippo, arriving at a fisherman's village in search of their friend, Tabby. And that's kind of it as far as the story goes. The general premise is that our friend, that we've never met before, tells us a girl, who may or may not be Tomba's new girlfriend even though we've never heard of her before, has been kidnapped. So we're out to save her, solving problems and doing quests along the way in typical Tomba fashion.
This is unknown territory here. Before we go, you better take this. This is an adventure journal. This is where your progress will be recorded. Press triangle to see.
Tomba 2 is an interesting game. Maybe not in the same sense that the original was interesting by being a big mesh of different titles that Tokudo Fujiwara had previously worked on. Some of that is definitely still present here, but instead it's more interesting because of the different direction the gaming industry had moved towards between the release of the original Tomba and its sequel. And how that reflects on Tomba 2 itself as a game trying to find its place within that, rather than trying to be a bigger and better iteration of an idea first and foremost. You still run, climb, bite, and throw your way across the stages like you did in the original Tomba. I don't want to repeat myself too much, so if you want to know more about how the first Tomba played, I recommend watching my old video review of that game instead. For this video, I want to focus on Tomba 2, because the layouts of the stages and the way the game unfolds feels much more like a product of its era than its predecessor ever did. While the original felt like a larger interconnected world where all the areas had their own points of interest somewhere within them, requiring you to explore and exploit the world as you gained more items and abilities to solve problems. Tomba 2, on the other hand, is designed a lot more linearly, giving the impression that the original had more modern design sensibilities. The original being a platformer with a larger adventure game angle, kind of like a Metroidvania, something that its follow-up just doesn't seem ready for. A lot of the areas feel like they exist to lead you to a problem near the end. A problem that you always solve with an item or an event somewhere within that same area. So you arrive in a place, find a cog somewhere, and open up the bridge to the next location.
Okay, it's up.
And then the next location will have a similar problem you have to solve in a similar fashion before you can move on. Map exits don't loop around themselves as often as they did in the original, giving the game a much more traditional and limiting feeling to it. I never felt like I was exploring a world, I was just progressing through linear stages that led to one another, since every stage exit was on the opposite end of the entrance, like a regular platformer. This doesn't have to be a bad thing by itself, it could lead to a more focused style of gameplay. But the general style of gameplay still revolves around a similar quest structure as the original, focusing on a sense of exploration that's not quite present here. Most of the quests are explicit about what you have to do, as the game dialogue will not just give away your objective at every turn, they'll also over-explain how to achieve it before allowing you to figure it out for yourself.
This is the trolley stop, all right, but without a trolley license, I can't let you ride.
They'll also go as far as to tell you what's going to happen when you succeed. So you won't have to wonder about the rewards of what's coming up in the next area, as the game will tell you when you come across most events.
I've heard, though, that a big freeze pig might be hiding inside.
And it will tell you with some of the most stilted voice acting I've featured on this channel, and I've featured my own voice on this channel.
In places where there's an arrow over your head, move by pressing up and down. Also, when talking to people, use up, down, and circle.
I've covered a lot of older games of this era and older.
But to be honest with you, I allowed myself to be caught. I didn't know any other way to find you.
But so far, this has been the game that made me wish there was no voice acting present the most. For a large variety of reasons.
Whoa, slow down there. Are you trying to put the fire out? Leave that to an adult. All right. Take that.
Sure, it's impressive that a PlayStation 1 game is fully voiced to this extent, but impressive doesn't always mean enjoyable. There's an extremely limited voice cast at work here, so most NPCs end up sounding like the same few people.
I just can't understand the creative urge.
Or, in some extreme cases, a singular NPC will sound like multiple different people depending on when you talk to them.
Oh, where's an ice boomerang when you really need it?
An ice boomerang?
That's right. Ice boomerangs are the only things that can cool them down.
Do you know where we can find one?
I seem to recall the evil pigs throwing it to the lava below. We couldn't get to it, though.
Have you used the animal dash? Its fast speed and jumping distance are mighty convenient. You move by... Also, you can use a weapon to extend distance and power. I've seen it work against enemies.
The voice acting itself is not the worst part of it. I'm sure the voice actors at least tried to give a decent performance, but they do expose how bad the localization effort for Tomba 2 was in general. My best guess as to what happened is that they extracted the text from the game and translated it with no context to what was happening on the screen at any given moment. PlayStation 1 translations were often a crapshoot when it came to working conditions, with even some of the most beloved games being translated by hacking into a finished game's code with a Game Shark, rather than the translation team being given access to the actual game files. The reason I think something like this must have been the case here is that characters very often talk without even knowing who they are, where they are, or who they're talking to.
Thanks for telling us. You're welcome in our temple anytime.
Characters will often refer to themselves as a group, or refer to you as themselves.
Then, you just ride the water up and out.
Or even just generally speak in very confusing terms. And knowing a bit of Japanese, I can see how this happened. Japanese tends to drop the subject from a sentence because within context, it's obvious to know what the subject will be. So rather than saying, I'm going, watashi wa ikimasu, you'd say, going, ikimasu. This can make it hard when people ask you to randomly translate a single sentence with no context because going isn't an informative sentence in English. We don't really talk like that, so without context, at best you take a guess at who is going. And from the sound of it, a lot of guesses were made in Tomba 2, and a lot of them ended up being wrong. And then those wrong guesses still got voiced.
Put that away here.
With those voice lines getting injected back into the game without any oversight whether they'd fit into the scenes or not.
Okay, I'm going to do it. The Supreme Ice Sculpture.
The lack of oversight also led to one of my favorite scenes in the game, where a voice actor flubs his line and restarts it mid-sentence.
This is our mouse temple. Actually, our protector gods, two Nashiki birds and their servant mice, are supposed to live here. But the Nashiki birds went away and servants were no longer needed. I myself was a temple protector. If you find the Nashiki... Okay, here we go, there we go, alright. If you find the Nashiki birds, please use these wings. The wind that strikes these wings should carry you back to the temple along with the Nishiki birds.
And this is just kept in its entirety in this game, forever. It's great. The lack of oversight and bad localization in general also contributes to another problem feeling a lot more painful than it needed to be. Our fun little sidekick, Zippo.
Bam! Is the gondola for going to the forest ready?
It is, but
What's wrong?
Zippo is part of the reason why people make such a big deal out of how much they dislike Navi in The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Not Zippo specifically, but Zippo is one of the many cases of developers injecting an exposition fairy as a shortcut to signaling things in a more reasonable way. The problem was never just Navi. The problem with Navi was that it represented a bigger shift in game design, where developers realized that they could have their silent protagonist while still having someone speak for them. This usually translates to an annoying sidekick character who throws out explanations at every possible direction, thinking players can't figure out anything for themselves. Since Zippo is the one who is talking for Tomba most of the time, the English script often loses track of who is talking when he opens his mouth. So he'll say he solved a problem or found the missing item when it was you who did those things, like he's trying to take credit for your hard work. The original game didn't need an exposition fairy, and I don't feel like much was added to this game with the addition beyond just confusion. Why is he here? Why is he aware of things that happened in the first game when he wasn't there for that? Why is he explaining things to us after we already did them? And that's still not the worst of it with the voice acting and text boxes in this game. You can probably already tell from the game audio, but every time you talk to an NPC in Tomba 2, a special event BGM plays. This ends up underlining how much of the flow of the game is being disrupted by these conversations. It's very awkward.
Now we can finally enter the houses. Because of the evil pigs, we can't get under the pipes. I hope nothing's happened there.
And that's all a shame because the general movement and gameplay of Tomba 2 is still really fun. The pure base gameplay itself is pretty much kept intact from the first game, which is great because there aren't too many games out there that play like this. It's also impressive how they handled a full 3D shift. All the 3D modeling and color choices really paid off, and the environments look really good, especially for a PlayStation 1 game. I think overall, Tomba 2 is a much nicer looking and more technically impressive game than its predecessor, even if I like Tomba's old 2D sprite better than his 3D model. But the new visual flair does come at a gameplay cost. Actually having a 3D world this time, they decided to not have the camera move on a 2D plane, so while your gameplay is still 2D, your path goes around corners, and even worse, the camera will move around a bunch to show off the scenery, taking the scenic route while you're just trying to play the video game. This makes jumping feel really awkward, since it's harder to track distances visually, and Tomba 2 doesn't shy away from camera movement during big jumps. It's especially annoying when you're trying to jump on top of enemies, which is the main way that you defeat them. The game seems to be aware of these issues since you get a bunch of special outfits that let you deal with obstacles more easily, like the bird suit that lets you stay in the air longer, and the flying squirrel suit that lets you stay in the air longer. That's 2 out of 3 suits in the game doing the exact same thing, and you get both of them pretty early into the adventure. For all the extra ease that they give in terms of platforming and dealing with the camera in a 2D game, they also just slow the pacing of the game down tremendously. But at least there's not as many loading screens between areas this time around. Though, I don't know if that trade is fully worth it with what has happened to the level design. Tomba 2's areas have a lot less to explore to them, and I get it. 3D development takes more time and is a lot more expensive, especially in those days. Even the minimum effort for 3D meant you couldn't just slap some Unity assets together and call it a day, you had to make everything from scratch. A lot of Tomba 1's areas looked kind of barren, but they also had a greater degree of verticality, and so much more side exits and loops to them. Tomba 2 wants you to see everything once and really take it in before moving on again. so the areas look more detailed and fleshed out, but there's a lot less to overcome and accomplish. Until the endgame, there's very little reason to go back and explore areas further because everything you need will always be in the newest area. I tried to look up some videos to figure out what happened during the development of Tomba 2, because I was getting really curious about it near the end. The design and structure felt streamlined and simplified in ways that felt regressive in a sense that's rare in video game sequels, since sequels try to go bigger and better most of the time. All I could find was a very old video interview of Tokuro Fujiwara done to market Tomba 2 before release, and a Schmupplation's translation of an old magazine interview that might have just been a transcription of that same interview. Most of what I got out of these interviews was that he didn't like how directionless 3D platformers were getting, and that he felt that 2D platformers are a lot more actionable and thus more fun, which does explain the linearity of Tomba 2 and why it holds your hand so much, to make sure that you know what the next action is at every corner. Then there was an unrelated interview with Swery by Frank Cifaldi, where Swery briefly mentions that he did the level design for the later half of Tomba 2, which, if accurate, means he likely designed the water temple. And that's the one area that actually splits off into different directions before looping back on itself, while also tying back into past areas. Basically, the one part of Tomba 2 that I really enjoyed. I also found this. Whatever this is. So, I cannot recommend Tomba 2. I didn't like it when I was a little kid, and replaying it all these years later, I now remember why. I remember disliking Zippo and the way the game wouldn't let you explore anymore. Beyond the new restrictions, Tomba 2 doesn't shake things up or add anything major to the formula that hadn't been done better in the first entry. So if you're playing just one game, play the first, and if you really want more after that, maybe give it a shot. It's not a terrible game, but it's also just not worth playing unless you're extremely nostalgic for it. And hey, I have my own nostalgic preferences that I like to pig out on every now and again. Speaking of pigging out, I asked the people supporting the channel on Patreon a very important question. Do you consider pigs to be a common video game enemy? Pretty much everyone agrees that pigs are not common enemies in video games at all. Sorry Chibi, you were wrong on that. Also, like this new animation, I slapped this together while I was away. It actually kind of looks like the Apex Legends character select screen, and I didn't realize that until I was almost done with it. Anyway, the next video, we're going to explore upwards. As always, this video was brought to you by people supporting the channel on Patreon. If you'd like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen right now and vote in future polls, head over to patreon.com/AboveUp and I will, see ya.